Today I've got two projectors that have generated a lot of buzz on the internet lately. The Formovie Theater Premium and the Nexigo Aurora Pro MK2. But are either of them good enough to take down my pick for the 2024 Best UST, the Hisense PX3-Pro? And can they beat out the original Nexigo Aurora Pro when it comes to darkroom viewing? Let's find out. First, let's take a little bit of a deep dive into brightness and contrast measurements. It's no secret that brightness is one of, if not the most important factor on a projector. But projector manufacturers don't make it easy to figure out what their advertised brightness actually means. Standardization into ISO lumens was a really good first step, where you take 9 individual brightness readings on a specific template and then you average those and multiply by the screen size in square meters. But most projectors have a bunch of different picture modes, and the brightest one, which is what they use for their advertising numbers, is probably not going to be the one that you choose to use because of poor contrast, color accuracy, and fan noise. So for every single projector, there are actually 3 important measurements. The peak brightness, where we make sure that a projector can actually achieve its advertised specs, which, as I said, is usually in a relatively unusable mode. Usable brightness, where reasonable compromises are made in color accuracy, contrast, and fan noise. And then accurate brightness, which is how many lumens the projector has on its most color accurate mode, preferably after calibration. And looking at these 4 projectors and their advertised brightness, all of them measured within the 10% margin of error that's allowed for advertised brightness claims, and they did that in usable brightness modes, which is great. And in their most color accurate modes, the PX3-Pro was still the brightest, but lost around 25% of its lumens when switching from standard to theater. The Aurora Pro lost 19%, the MK2 lost 17%, and the Formovie Theater Premium lost 24%. And right out of the box, their color accuracy was okay, but not great, with the PX3-Pro coming in with an average SDR color error of 5.17 when measured with Calman Ultimate's color checker. The Aurora Pro MK2 was very close behind that at 5.35, followed by the Aurora Pro 1 at 5.96, and then the Formovie Theater was the least accurate out of the box with an average delta error of 9.21. To make filming and comparisons easier, I did calibrate each of these projectors to a color delta error under 4 and a white balance error under 2. Which cost the Hisense and Nexigo projectors a few more lumens, but actually gained back a few more lumens for the Formovie Theater Premium. And next we need to talk about contrast, which is another tricky stat because there's a lot of different ways to measure contrast and even more ways to gain the system. And the first thing I need to measure on each of these projectors is their native contrast. And the most common way to measure this full on, full off contrast is by measuring the brightness of an all white screen and then comparing it to an all black screen. But because manufacturers like to bake in tricks and what's called non-defeatable dimming, I use this pattern with a moving 50% gray box to help prevent those dimming tricks. And in this test of their native contrast ratio, you can see that the PX3-Pro, Aurora Pro 1, and Aurora Pro MK2 basically all have the same native contrast, around 3200 to 1, which seems to be the current limitation of the 0.47-inch Texas Instruments DMD when it's installed in an ultra short throw projector. But the Formovie Theater Premium, which has that same chip, measured a little lower for whatever reason at 2513 to 1, which is still pretty good. However, the next thing to measure is called the dynamic contrast, and that's the really tricky one. Dynamic contrast can use a bunch of tricks like laser dimming, and in the case of the Aurora Pro MK2, a dynamic iris that can open and close to allow different amounts of light to pass. But there are 2 main problems with dynamic contrast. First, even though laser dimming can drastically lower the black floor of a projector, laser dimming doesn't increase the native contrast of a projector. So while the black levels do get better, it will also limit the maximum brightness of any of the highlights in that scene. Dynamic iris, though, is a little bit different because in general a fully closed iris will have a higher native contrast than a fully open iris, so you can actually gain more intrascene contrast, but it's much harder to subtly move the iris without creating artifacts in the image. And that's the second problem with dynamic contrast, which is that even an extremely polished dimming algorithm will be noticeable and bothersome to some people. And while most people will need to be searching for laser dimming artifacts like brightness pumping and color shifting, even an untrained eye can probably notice the artifacts of a slowly moving dynamic iris. Luckily, if those things do bother you, all the projectors have options to disable their dynamic contrast, but I personally think that the benefits massively outweigh their occasional imperfections, and using their dynamic modes after calibration, I was able to measure 5,293 to 1 dynamic contrast on the Nexigo Aurora Pro, 10,335 to 1 on the Hisense PX3-Pro, and a massive 26,231 to 1 dynamic contrast ratio on the Aurora Pro MK2 using Iris Bright and Scene Adapt Engine Mid. And usually at this point in the video, I start tournament-style side-by-side comparisons. But I figured since there's only 4 projectors, it would make sense to put all 4 of them on the screen and then go through a little bit of what I'm looking for when I'm evaluating them. Starting with SDR content, I do need to note that the Formovie Theater Premium has the latest firmware update that enabled 3D and had some bug fixes, but it still doesn't use the right color space by default. So for SDR content, you need to go to the color space option and change it from auto to on, which makes it use the same color space as the video source. And when looking at all 4 images side by side, the first question to ask is which one looks the best, as in which one is the most eye-catching. And it's usually the result of brightness and interesting contrast. And if I stop on a random frame, you can see that all the projectors look pretty good. But the Formovie Theater Premium has crushed some of the shadow detail in Danny's hair, and the PX3-Pro has a lot more brightness in the patch of sky in the upper left-hand corner. Sometimes it is difficult to judge color accuracy when there are 4 similar images side by side, but to me the skin tones look the best on the PX3-Pro and the Aurora Pro MK2, with the Formovie Theater leaning a bit too pink and saturated and the Aurora Pro 1 looking a little bit blotchy. And when we bring in the reference footage, which is the raw video file not being played through any device, you can see that the PX3-Pro pretty much nailed it in terms of skin tone accuracy and tone mapping. But none of them handled that patch of sky in the upper left-hand corner particularly well, and the Aurora Pro 1 and MK2 were a little bit too dim, while the PX3-Pro was too white and too bright. And I think that the Formovie Theater Premium was the closest to the source in terms of background colors. Moving on to Henry, we can see that the PX3-Pro nailed the skin tones again, but the pocket on Henry's shirt has almost disappeared, especially when compared to the Aurora Pro MK2 and Formovie Theater Premium. And shifting our focus to the background, I think that the Formovie Theater Premium was by far the closest to the source, but without the reference footage, I would say that the Aurora Pro MK2 was the most eye-catching. In dark scenes, you can see that the PX3-Pro with high dynamic enabled prioritized black levels at the expense of highlights, which meant it not only had the dimmest overall image, but it also lost most of the shadow detail. And while the Formovie Theater Premium clearly had the highest black floor, it was also the only one that showed that wrinkle in Henry's sleeve. Though if you check the reference footage, I think that that's probably too much shadow detail. And when comparing the overall brightness, the PX3-Pro is actually the closest to the reference, while to me the Aurora Pro MK2 was the most eye-catching, with a good mix of bright highlights and dark shadows. And if we move a little further in the scene, the same is basically true, where the Formovie Theater Premium had raised black levels with a ton of shadow detail, the Aurora Pro MK2 was the most eye-catching, and the Hisense PX3-Pro was the closest to the source. And that means that overall for SDR content, the PX3-Pro was the most true to the source in terms of color accuracy, but it did crush some of the shadow detail. The Aurora Pro MK2 was consistently the most eye-catching image with the most dynamic range, and the Formovie Theater Premium had the best colors in terms of saturation, but it had a higher black floor and it struggled to accurately represent skin tones. Moving on to Dolby Vision content, this is Season 1, Episode 4 of Obi-Wan on Disney+, and Dolby Vision is specifically where the Formovie Theater Premium has the biggest issues, because for Dolby Vision, the color space menu is unavailable, and the Formovie still has the bug where it defaults to the wider BT 2020 color space even when the content should be in DCI-P3 or BT709, which ultimately results in oversaturated colors, especially the reds, and there's unfortunately no way to fix it other than disabling Dolby Vision at the source. And if we grab a frame before the lights go out, the Formovie Theater Premium is definitely the most eye-catching and vibrant image, but it's not particularly close to what the source material is supposed to look like. While the Aurora Pro MK2 has good color representation and good dynamic range, and the PX3-Pro is somewhere in the middle, slightly more saturated than it should be, but not to the point of being completely wrong. When the lights go out, the Aurora Pro 1 actually did the best job with shadow detail, maintaining some of the highlights on that back wall, and the Aurora Pro MK2 had the biggest brightness differences between the darkest parts of the scene and the lightsaber strikes. But the Aurora Pro 1 and Hisense PX3-Pro were more true to the source during those bright portions. And again, you can see that the Formovie Theater Premium was just nowhere close to correct in terms of color, since it was using the wrong color space for this content. But it does look kinda cool, I guess. And the same was also true for Wakanda Forever, where the Formovie Theater Premium looked pretty neat, but it was massively oversaturated. And it also had a noticeably higher black floor than the other 3 projectors, while the Aurora Pro MK2 managed to achieve a similarly punchy image by increasing the dynamic range without oversaturating the colors. And while I think all the projectors ended up darkening the scene more than it should have been, the Aurora Pro MK2 was the clear frontrunner in terms of color accuracy, saturation, and dynamic range. And last, taking a look at the infamous staircase scene from 1917, played back in forced HDR10, so I was able to change the color space setting on the Formovie Theater Premium. The Hisense PX3-Pro with its high dynamic mode and dynamic tone mapping enabled absolutely killed it in terms of black level, shadow detail, and contrast, with the Aurora Pro MK2 coming in second, the Aurora Pro 1 in third, and the Formovie Theater Premium in a distant last place due to a lack of any dynamic contrast options. So that means for overall picture quality, all four projectors are pretty top tier, but the PX3 Pro and Aurora Pro MK2 were a cut above, with the MK2 specifically excelling with Dolby Vision content, and the PX3 Pro handling HDR10 quite a bit better. I thought the original Aurora Pro 1 put up an extremely solid performance with no major issues, and the Formovie Theater Premium definitely has potential, but it is crazy to me that they just pushed the first major firmware update since its release, and they didn't fix the color space bug. And I also think that dynamic contrast, which the Formovie Theater Premium lacks, is almost a requirement these days. But as I said, dynamic contrast is not without its faults, so let me point out some of those, starting with the Nexigo Aurora Pro MK2, which uses laser dimming and dynamic iris to achieve its 26,000:1 contrast ratio. And in most scenes, it was really effective and barely noticeable. But sometimes it just can't figure things out, and the opening of the Obi-Wan scene is a pretty good example of that. And here I'm going to slow down the video and pay attention to the background as the scene switches perspectives. And you'll notice not only the opening and closing of the iris, but also the adjustment of the laser diode power, which leads to not only a noticeable brightness pump from the iris, but also a color shift from the laser dimming. And if you then switch your focus to any of the other projectors, you won't see those same artifacts. In the dark scene in Gemini Man, you can see the same laser dimming artifacts in both the Aurora Pro 1 and the MK2, with some flickering instead of just a subtle dimming like the AP1. And occasionally the artifacts are even more jarring, like the water grenade explosion from Wakanda Forever, which almost looks like the MK2 switched its picture settings for a split second, and ideally all these artifacts will be fixed by software by updating its dimming and iris algorithms, but there's always going to be edge cases where the image processor doesn't know exactly what to do with the scene. So if these are the kind of things that are going to totally spoil your movie watching experience, you'd probably want to turn off the dynamic iris setting completely and set the screen adapt engine to low, which still gives an excellent viewing experience without artifacts but with a higher black floor. Moving on to the issues with the Hisense PX3-Pro, in terms of its high dynamic contrast mode, in the hundreds of hours that I've watched it, I've only noticed dimming artifacts a handful of times. And overall, I have been extremely happy with the PX3-Pro, but it does have one downfall that I am becoming increasingly aware of, which is its pure RGB triple laser light source. The basic concept of how a single chip DLP projector works is that there is an array of tiny mirrors inside the projector called a digital micromirror device. And for every frame, the image processor breaks up the image into red, green, and blue subframes, and then it aligns each pixel mirror to correspond with one color subframe, and then flashes that color, and repeats those steps for red, green, and blue consecutively. And because our eyes have something called persistence of vision, our brain can then combine those three subframes into a full color image. And to make that red, green, and blue light, older projectors used light bulbs that passed through a spinning color wheel. But then we moved on to RGB LED light sources and single lasers with spinning phosphor wheels. And now we have pure RGB laser light sources and hybrid light sources that have RGB lasers, color wheels, and LEDs combined. And the major upside to these RGB lasers comes from their increased brightness and wider color gamuts. But there are some drawbacks, and if you'll indulge me as a former biology and physics teacher, I want to talk a little bit about color science, but I will try to make it quick. You may already know that humans have three types of cone cells in our eyes that detect red, green, and blue light. But it's not quite that simple, because the red and green cones react to a lot of the same wavelengths. So a yellow object in real life, for instance, would reflect light with a wavelength around 570 nanometers, which would stimulate both the red and green cones equally. And then our brains would tell us that we were looking at the color yellow. However, on a display, we can't make real yellow since there are only red, green, and blue pixels. So we trick our eyes by shining equal intensity red and green lights, which then has the same effect of equally stimulating both cones. So our brains then tell us that we must be looking at a yellow light instead of just a mix of red and green. And in real life, if you saw an extremely intense deep red color, your red cones would be highly stimulated without your green cones getting stimulated at all. So for a projector to produce a deep red like the ones on the edges of the BT 2020 color space, it needs to not only be able to produce the bright red light that stimulates the red cone, but it also needs to avoid stimulating the green cone. So using a laser with a really narrow distribution of wavelength is ideal for replicating those saturated deep colors. However, 1 in about every 12 men, including myself according to an online test, have some amount of red-green color blindness, where the red detecting L cones have a sensitivity curve that overlaps more with the green cone. So while I can still see a real yellow object with 500 nanometer light, tricking me into seeing that same yellow object is a little bit harder because that narrow band of red light now only activates my red cone half as much as the green cone. So instead of seeing yellow, I would see that as more of a lime green color. And in fact, every single color that involves red and green would be shifted towards the green spectrum. But if I calibrate the projector to look good to my eyes by raising the power of the red laser, my wife and daughter always think the projector looks way too red because their red cones have a typical sensitivity. And keep in mind here that I have the mildest form of color blindness possible, so much so that the test that I took said that my red cone sensitivity was actually within the margin of error for the test. So someone with a larger deficiency is going to see an even larger green shift. However, hybrid light sources like the ones on the Formovie Theater Premium, Aurora Pro 1, and Aurora Pro MK2 are less prone to these issues because they combine their pure RGB lasers with a blue laser and phosphor wheel that creates a bunch of other secondary wavelengths for each color. And those secondary wavelengths do a better job with red cone stimulation regardless of any type of color blindness. So the point is, in the simplest terms, a projector with a hybrid light source is going to be more likely to look the same to multiple people than one that has a pure RGB triple laser. So with all that science stuff out of the way, let's get back to doing some more typical tests on these projectors, starting with their focus and clarity. And for this test, I project this image with no keystone, and then I dial in the center focus, and then I take individual pictures of each corner zoomed in on the smallest text. And in this test, you can see that the PX3-Pro was the best with crisp, sharp focus in each corner. The Aurora Pro MK2 was the second best, which is a huge deal since corner focus was my biggest complaint with the previous generation. The Formovie Theater Premium was in a very close third with slightly soft focus in the upper left, and the Aurora Pro 1 has always struggled with top left corner focus, and this unit was no different, putting it in a distant last place. I also tested their input lag, which is important if you want to play video games on your projector, and in general, input lag numbers under 20 milliseconds are good for all games. Between 20 milliseconds and 50 milliseconds is acceptable but not great, and anything above 100 milliseconds just won't work because the delay between pressing a button on your controller and seeing that action on the screen is just too long. And at 4K 60Hz, the PX3-Pro, Aurora Pro 1, and Aurora Pro MK2 had 17.6 milliseconds of input lag, which is about 1 millisecond higher than the lowest possible single frame input lag of 16.7 milliseconds, and the Formovie Theater Premium was 1 millisecond higher than that at 18.3 milliseconds total. But for 1080p 120Hz, the PX3-Pro was quite a bit better at 9.1 milliseconds compared to 12.4 on the Nexigo Aurora Pro and Aurora Pro 2. And it seemed like the Formovie Theater Premium didn't actually output 1080p 120Hz, and as a result, the input lag numbers bounced between 30 and 45 milliseconds depending on which frames were being dropped. And at 240Hz, the PX3-Pro also had an impressively low 4.6 milliseconds of input lag, while the Nexigo projectors had inconsistent readings between 8 and 12 milliseconds, indicating occasional dropped frames, and the Formovie was the worst, bouncing between 24 and 32 milliseconds. In other words, the PX3-Pro is the easy choice for gaming, and if you have a Formovie, you should really only use it on 4K 60Hz because all the other refresh rates are worse performance. As I mentioned, this latest big update for the Formovie Theater Premium fixed its 3D compatibility, and I tested each projector's 3D performance using the film A Turtle's Tale, which has some of the most extreme 3D effects of any movie available, and I thought the Aurora Pro 1 was the best here with the strongest 3D effect, good eye comfort, and good color. The Aurora Pro MK2 was very similar with strong 3D effect and good eye comfort, but I did have to significantly reduce the brightness setting to avoid blowing out the highlights. The Formovie did have a good 3D effect and decent eye comfort, but the colors weren't quite right, and I wasn't able to fix them, and the Hisense 3D is still not good. And even though the 3D effect works, I found it very uncomfortable to watch. I also tested their potential for the DLP Rainbow effect using my test pattern, where I subjectively grade each projector's performance relative to each other, and to me there was no discernible difference between any of these four projectors, and they all had what I would consider a normal or moderate amount of RBE. Another potential issue that you might run into with a pure RGB laser projector is called laser speckle, which can look like grainy interference patterns on the screen, especially in large single color areas. But laser speckle tends to not be as big of a deal with ultra short throw projectors, since the screens that they're designed to be used with do a pretty good job of mitigating it. However, I have definitely noticed laser speckle plenty of times in the last 6 months that I've been using the PX3-Pro, but the Aurora Pro 1 and Formovie Theater Premium have much less speckle due to that additional phosphor wheel, and the Aurora Pro MK2 takes it one step further, adding RGB LEDs to the light path, which reduces the speckle even further while maintaining high color gamut. So finally, all things considered, which ultra short throw projector is the best? On paper, looking at brightness, picture quality, color accuracy, and input lag, the Hisense PX3-Pro stands out as easily the best ultra short throw projector on the market in 2025. And in the last 6 months that I've been using it as my main projector, I have been extremely impressed by it. So much so that it's hard to imagine what I'm about to say next. And that is that I will be personally switching to the Aurora Pro MK2 based almost entirely on the fact that it has a hybrid laser light source that's easier for me to calibrate to look good for everybody in my family, without any green or red shifts. And the fact that they've basically eliminated laser speckle is also a huge plus. Nexigo is definitely still actively and regularly updating their firmware, so I'm hopeful that they're going to be able to get their dynamic dimming algorithm polished to the point where it can at least avoid the most jarring artifacts. If you currently have an Aurora Pro 1 and you're bothered by the corner focus, I think the Aurora Pro MK2 is a worthy upgrade, but other than that, I definitely thought the Aurora Pro 1 still held its own in side-by-side testing and is an awesome projector for the price, especially when it's on sale. And last, the Formovie Theater Premium was a little bit disappointing for me, coming in with lower brightness and lower native contrast than the original Aurora Pro, with no dynamic dimming, buggy 120 and 240 Hz outputs, and I've got to say the inability to correctly display Dolby Vision content with the correct color space definitely doesn't seem like a projector that should command a $2,800 price tag. As always, there are no sponsored reviews on this channel, but I do have links down in the description for all the projectors in this video, and I do appreciate when you use those links, since as an Amazon affiliate, I do earn a small commission on the sale at no cost to you. I'd also like to thank all of my awesome patrons over at Patreon for their continued support of my channel, and if you're interested in supporting my channel, please check out the links down in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, and as always, thanks for watching The Hookup.